Good afternoon. This is the last session of a long day, so thank you for coming. It's also, we have to keep in mind the time a bit because we have to get on the bus at 6:30. So we will try to go through the presentations as quickly as we can and then have time for some discussion. My name is Anna Viggh. I work at the Jeff Independent Evaluation Office. And this is the third session on environment, on adaptation to climate change. And it's on lessons from recent experience. And we have four panelists, and they have decided to sit over there. But they are here. The others sat over here. And what I'd like to do is introduce them one by one, have them come up here, make their presentation for about 15 minutes, and then we will hold the questions until the end of all the presentations, unless you have a burning question of some clarification of that particular evaluation. So we're going to start with a presentation on trends from the OECD DAC Network on Development Evaluation. And it's by Megan Kennedy Schuon. Megan works at the OECD managing the DAC Network on Development Evaluation. Previously, Megan worked at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation in London, managing a portfolio of evidence, measurement, and evaluation work on climate change mitigation in Latin America, Europe, and China. From 2017 to 2019, Megan led the Bright Beginners Early Childhood Development Initiative, a cross-sector collaboration to improve the lives of young children and their families in Monterey County, California.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I will give you a quick overview of some highlights of the work of the OECD DAC related to evaluating climate adaptation interventions. And I've also included some slides at the end that point you to further reading and further resources. So I won't go into too much detail today. Who is the EvalNet? The OECD Development Assistance Committee, or the DAC, has a network on development evaluation. We've been around for almost 40 years now, and our focus is on improving and increasing the number and improving the quality of evaluations of development activities. It brings together the heads of the evaluation units, generally independent or central evaluation units, from 30 OECD ministries of foreign affairs or development agencies. So that would be your DFIDs, JICAs, BMZ, etc., as well as 5 regional banks, the World Bank, IMF, and UNDP. We're essentially a forum for dialogue, and we also work to develop norms and standards and to support collaboration. So, well, I guess you can't see what we do, but I can share that later. So I was just going to mention that our role is primarily one of supporting evaluation practice and supporting innovation as well. And we also try to help get the findings from evaluations into policy. So we do synthesis work. We've recently done some work looking at forestry and sustainable land management in forests. That was then shared with our environment colleagues and others working on issues around development cooperation and forestry. Of course, we also spend a good deal of time enforcing the DAC evaluation criteria with a very firm grip and finding those that we find are not using them properly. So you'll hear more about that, I think, over the course of these days. Okay, just keep it there. Okay. Okay, so here we go. There you can see our activities. So why are we talking about adaptation? I don't think I need to preach to the choir on this one, but I think climate adaptation is a really good example of the theme of this conference about the universal nature of the learning and accountability needs related to climate. So we know a number of developing countries, Mali, Bangladesh, others that have quite a bit more experience evaluating climate-focused and adaptation-focused interventions compared to, say, OECD member countries. So there's a good amount of potential for learning there. Also, we know that, as in other areas, development cooperation has a lot more evaluation experience compared to other national evaluation units. And an example of this is the International Climate Fund in the United Kingdom, where they really drew extensively on DFID's international development evaluation experience in setting up their international climate evaluation functions. So there's a lot of scope for drawing lessons from other areas of development evaluation. Now, when I talk about evaluation of adaptation, I think it's important to note that there are particular challenges, and probably all of you can name many of the challenges that you faced in your own work. I think these are generally a difference of degree and not a difference of type. So there are challenges that we see in other areas of evaluation, say evaluating health interventions, evaluating peace-building interventions, but there are some unique aspects to climate adaptation. There are issues around assessing attribution, of course. There's this issue which we've not come up with a good term for, but we call the non-outcomes. So evaluating things that didn't happen because of what you've done. We have a similar challenge in conflict prevention work. So how do you value a negative impact of a disaster that was avoided because of your intervention and adaptation work? Some have called it the so-called dog that didn't bark. There are also challenges around baselines and targets, shifting baselines. So what is the scope for and the need for adaptation actions? And then that need may change over the course of an intervention. And of course, dealing with long time horizons and unknowns. And finally, the hard and soft adaptation limits, which is a concept I think that's quite widespread in the adaptation community, but perhaps has not been sufficiently dealt with from an evaluation perspective. So this idea that there are sort of unacceptable levels of risk beyond which we should not go. And so when you're drawing conclusions from an evaluation perspective, it's not enough to simply say, well, we're slightly more resilient than we were before, or we've adapted slightly, we have better capacity for adaptation. But how far has that taken us away from a limit that is considered unacceptable in terms of the impact on human lives? And so I think those concepts have not been sufficiently dealt with from an evaluation perspective. So we did a short review of the DAC, which is our online evaluation resource center. The website's there. You can feel free to browse it yourself. We have some 4,000 evaluations on that website. And we identified, I was rather surprised, only 22 that we could see were specifically focused on adaptation evaluations. Many of these covered climate resilience and adaptation together with broader climate interventions, or sometimes even country program evaluations that just included adaptation as one dimension of the evaluation. We found 7 funds or funding portfolio evaluations. So for example, the Least Developed Countries Fund has been evaluated. And 4 evaluations of specific adaptation projects or programs, and 3 syntheses. So overall, really quite limited. And of course, our database, it only includes evaluations from our members. So it's a limited sample, it's not comprehensive. We don't have many project level evaluations. But I would say in general that the number of evaluations is quite limited, and the depth of analysis on adaptation issues was also very limited. I'll just give you a couple of examples and highlights of some of the observations we made from this quick review. So a number of the, I'm sorry, there's no more animation, so you just get all the text right at once in your face. I apologize. Several evaluations found that adaptation was performing better compared to mitigation, which is sort of interesting. One quote here from the Swiss Effectiveness Review said that the overall picture was much stronger for adaptation, with around 1/3 of projects showing very strong effectiveness, and the majority showing moderate to strong effectiveness. Now, we don't know enough to know is that because the adaptation projects are actually doing better, or are the evaluations for some reason concluding that perhaps there's a positive bias in the adaptation evaluations? We don't know. But that was interesting to see a number of evaluations pointing to that. Synergies are underexploited, and that was something many evaluations found, that despite a lot of talk about integrating climate adaptation, mainstreaming it with development objectives, having win-wins or win-win-wins with climate mitigation, adaptation, and development, those sort of multifaceted results chains are often not explicitly integrated into development interventions. Also, quite a sobering finding in several evaluations about a very low level of ownership from national and local partners. This evaluation from Canada found that one of the major shortcomings was the lack of participation of developing country partners in both the design of interventions and the selection of projects, so both prioritization and design. In some instances, partnerships were not solidified before projects were approved, so you actually had projects beginning on the ground that had not been fully taken on board by local governments or partners. Insufficient action and shallow treatment. So most evaluations concluded in some way or form that the actions are quite insufficient to the scale of the problems being faced. And there was a frequent recommendation for the need for massive scaling up of the efforts. Also, this notion that you have a lot of successful but small and sort of incremental projects that are in no way adding up to the major transformative change quickly enough or at the scale that's required given the current situation. And finally, quite uneven coverage of the evaluations, and I would guess you see this also on adaptation programming side, but resilient agriculture is receiving a lot more attention, also a lot of work on clean energy access, but then other sectors that have been quite neglected. So one of the reports I will let you all read on your own, but the IOB, the Independent Evaluation Unit for the Dutch government, did a very good synthesis of adaptation mainstreaming. And they found some really interesting key points around what they've seen in terms of both mainstreaming adaptation, but also the monitoring and evaluation of that work. I think here we see again this tendency towards an overemphasis on indicators alone and monitoring of indicators, without sufficient attention to evaluating the causal chain and what's explaining why indicators are moving in the direction that they are moving. So a real call for much deeper focus and an analytical lens to be taken to adaptation activities. Finally, what are the evaluation issues we're seeing? The syntheses have identified weak and disparate evidence base, as I mentioned, many project level evaluations, but there's not a sufficient evidence base to support more strategic learning, more focus on the inputs and less analysis down the results chain. The lack of a suitable or agreed baseline data that then leads to very weak monitoring, so that when an evaluation comes along, there's not much there to evaluate. There's a lack of data to draw conclusions on effectiveness. And again, insufficient coverage of trade-offs, which I think is quite interesting because many policies are now pointing to the synergies and the potential for complementarity between environmental and human development objectives, and yet evaluations are really not going very far in the analysis of potential trade-offs or synergies in the climate field. I think that's a real area for further exploration. Finally, we looked at our inventory of evaluation plans, which is a place where we collect what our members are currently or planning to evaluate. And I can't surprise you now with the number because it's not being animated, but only 5% of the planned or ongoing evaluations are related to environment and climate in the broadest sense. And of those, only 5 are specifically related to climate change, resilience, or adaptation. So really quite a low, at least I was quite surprised. Maybe some of you think that you probably see that every day, so you're not surprised, but I was quite surprised by how low that is, given the attention that we're hearing on both mitigation and adaptation right now. So some real evidence gaps and evaluation gaps that we've seen. That gives you a bit of an introduction to the rest of the discussion we're going to have today. And again, within the OECD DAC EvalNet, climate change adaptation is a topic that we expect to be coming up again in the future. And we're interested to hear from other partners here about what do you see as the key issues that need to be tackled, and how can we support more and better evaluation in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Any questions for clarifications, or can we move on? Okay, one question. It has to be quick.
Yeah, I just look at your map, and what I saw is that you considered some countries that are in the EU, but I was wondering if you also looked at the rural development programs and the common monitoring and evaluation system, because there are specific indicators that target adaptation mitigation. So I was wondering maybe you could check it, because that would mean that there are more of such exercises carried out, at least in the European Union. Thank you.
This is only looking at DAC member countries and the multilateral banks. And so we are not including many, especially project level evaluations. And the countries that are included here are those that are ODA eligible, which is the focus of evaluation work that we do. Yeah.
Thank you, Megan, for that comprehensive summary of the trends we see in the DAC Evaluation Network. I would like to introduce our next speaker. The next presentation will be an overview of ongoing evaluations on climate change adaptation by the German Institute for Development Evaluation, also known as DVAL. Sven is a deputy director at DVAL. He has more than 15 years of experience in design and implementation of evaluations in the field of development cooperation, and is currently working on climate change adaptation evaluation. Previously, he worked as an independent consultant for the World Bank, the European Commission, and several change management and evaluation consultancy firms. Go ahead. I hope it works like that.
Let's see how it works. Do I need to sit here for the camera, or can I stand up and move? You can do. Okay, great. Yeah, see how I can multitask and handle this, but since it's sort of late afternoon, prefer to stand up and talk and see you a bit better. Okay, so Megan said only 5 evaluations. I think I'm going to talk about one of those. Or maybe number 6, not sure, we should check whether we registered, but of course we did. So basically, I'm going to talk about an evaluation that you'll forget as soon as you leave the room, because unfortunately, the findings are not yet published. So what I'm going to share with you are preliminary findings that will soon come out. But for that reason, sort of the slides won't be on the server later on. But I hope in a couple of weeks' time from now we'll present the results. So you get a sneak preview. How exciting is that? Okay. So this is actually a 3-year project at DEVAL where we're going to look at climate change adaptation, and it's separated into 4 modules. And I'm going to talk only about the first module, which is the portfolio analysis and allocation study. But there are 3 more to come, so hopefully to see you at other conferences and talk a bit more about other findings. So the second module is about the adaptation processes and sectors, where we look at specifically 3 core sectors: water, agriculture, marine, and coastal biodiversity. Then the third module is something quite interesting. It's on loss and damage, which we don't use. So it's called Residual Risks. Risk transfer, capacity development, everything that deals with sort of what happens after limits to adaptations are reached, which nobody in a developed country is allowed to say, apparently, because you can always adapt, I think is the official position. So we have that residual risk, which will be an interesting model. And then the last one is actually on climate proving of development cooperation in Germany. So some more things to come. This one I don't really need to explain to you, because preaching to converted, I guess. But the interesting bit here is that even though we have 3 years to cover this topic until 2021, and we have a large team and quite some money to do this, we can't do this alone. The topic is too large for us, so at the end you'll see my contact details, and I would really appreciate if those of you who are working on similar topics, well, I see some known faces here in the audience, reach out, and that we can discuss if we can do something together in this space. So that's sort of our first lesson after the portfolio analysis. And for that module, so those are the evaluation questions for that first module. This is really trying to understand in Germany, where does the money go? What is the rationale for allocation of funds? And is this really relevant, complementary, aligned to strategies, to priorities, both for Germans and for our stakeholders? The evaluation questions you'll see later in detail. Just in terms of the methodology, sort of it's been a 4-step process that the team has done. So we developed some hypotheses on German strategies, so what you would expect to find, then do a portfolio analysis, regression analysis, and then sort of the evaluation exercise, evaluative thinking, and coming out with some judgment. So now the exciting part. What are some results? So the first thing is, for German development cooperation, and I guess for many others, there should actually be a parity between mitigation, funding, and adaptation. What we see is that parity we only have at the level of the secondary objectives. So for those of you who know CRS data, you have the primary objectives, secondary objectives. For the secondary, we'll see that. For the primary, we don't. So that's something. If somebody wants to practice some German, I have to apologize. Not everything is in English. So that was my bad preparation for this. But so that's the first interesting bit in terms of the main goals. Mitigation receives still lots more fund than adaptation. Second one. Well, this is at least somewhat positive finding, in the sense that we have the strategy of support for the poorest countries should be a priority, and the SIDS, small island development states. And at least as you see from the dark blues, and that's also in the data, for the poorest countries, they receive most of the funding. So far so good, the SIDS don't. And that's not because it's just a map and you don't see the SIDS. They receive relatively little funds. Another one, which is quite interesting, is so you have priority sectors for German development cooperation, and those are water, agriculture, environment. And addressing those sectors with the main goals works relatively well. It works even better if you look at both, so the primary and secondary goal. So the Ministry of Development Cooperation was reasonably happy with that finding. Now, this is something a bit controversial, and I must admit I'm not sort of an expert in this methodology, but we've been criticized a bit for that, using the TAN methodology that sort of maps country-level priorities that they have in the NDCs, National Determined Contributions. And we looked at whether we see a match between TAN priorities and German commitments. Well, fortunately, as main objectives, we see an overlap. So that's great. That's relatively positive. However, those commitments were actually decided before the NDCs. So I'll let you judge that sort of on your own. And secondly is that if you look at the large share of commitments that have the secondary goal, there's actually a low degree of agreement. Hard to say as a German. So there's a question on causality here, but at least we see for now that there is sort of a match. And again, for those of you who know better whether or not you can use the TAN is apparently up for debate. Another one, I talked to a colleague also today. This seems to be an issue in other bilateral, for other bilateral donors. So the German strategy is to give more to civil society organizations. You could say with increasing amounts overall, there is maybe a slight increase in funding through civil society organizations, but as a share of German development cooperation, it's stable. So that's the blue on the bottom. It stays more or less at 10%. 5 minutes, oh, I'm doing great. Next one. Well, this is probably nothing new, but whenever you present this to ministries and stuff, they are, oh, that's very interesting. Vulnerability is concentrated. So I can skip that. And what we actually see is that, so we have the strategic objective that support should obviously go to countries most effective, right? And we actually see in the data that climate vulnerability influences the decision of allocation, but not so much in terms of the volume. So yes or no, that's why it's 0 and 1 binary. Vulnerability is a factor, not so much in terms of the numbers, how much they get. And it gets actually a bit more interesting because what we see is quite colorful, but it's uneven distributed where the money from German development cooperation goes. So some countries, the dark blues, actually receive a lot more. Oh, I should say, this is the Notre Dame methodology for those of you who didn't know already. So the dark blue are the countries that receive relatively more than we would expect them. So we have got Mongolia here, Morocco, Mauritania as dark blues, and some other countries receive relatively little or less than what we would expect. So the distribution according to vulnerability is something that can be improved. Okay, next one. This is probably for all of you working in bilateral development, something that you know that you face a lot. in Germany, it's perhaps even more complicated and complex than in other bilateral, for other bilateral donors. But the division of labor between the technical and financial cooperation can still be improved. But I'll skip that. Because this is actually why I'm here, I guess. One of the things that we see, and actually I don't know what the causality here is. Trying to be a modest German citizen, our interpretation, or my interpretation, is that German development cooperation is going there where already many other of our peers, of other donors are. So what we see in the data is that the more active other donors are in partner countries, the more likely that we see German funds. Well, maybe some other peers are following Germany, but I would doubt that. So we're following perhaps our neighbors and friends. In any case, there's a question for discussion for all of us here. Does that really work? Specifically, if we consider what I was showing you before, right? Not all vulnerable countries are receiving their fair share. So we have big concentration in countries that are receiving proportionally less than they should. And then we have that big concentration of donors in some countries which are perhaps easier to work with. So in that sense, in that sense, we've got a lot to do as evaluators to support our operational colleagues to work better on coordination of donor efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. Before you go, I have one question for you. What is the time frame for completing this evaluation? I think it's a lot of interesting work going on, and you're giving us the preliminary findings, and I'm sure people would be interested in finding out when it would be completed.
Thank you for that easy question. So the entire evaluation is until 2021. The results of the portfolio analysis and allocation study that I was just showing, those should be published in the next couple of weeks. But we'll continue working on those other modules that I was showing until 2021. And each module has a report coming out, so one report per year. 2020, 2021, we'll have 2 reports actually. So.
Thank you. I see there's a question for clarification.
Dennis Boers of the Technical Evaluation Reference Group of the Adaptation Fund. Is this German development money that goes bilaterally, or does it also include contributions through the JEF, LDCF, GCF and Adaptation Fund?
So from the results I was showing, this is the bilateral. However, we also looked at money channeled through multilateral organizations, but some of the analysis there would have been a bit difficult. Oh, we did that, but it was not. I wasn't too sort of convinced to show this year. So those results are bilateral.
Thank you, Sven. Our third speaker is Timo Leiter. His presentation is, what impacts have climate change adaptation measures achieved? A systemic review of adaptation evaluations. Timo is an internationally recognized expert in monitoring and evaluation of climate adaptation with almost a decade of experience in international development, climate policy, and climate finance. Currently, he is a doctoral researcher at the London School of Economics and Political Science and works as an independent consultant. From 2017 to 2019, Timo was the climate change focal point and head of adaptation support for Germany's Technical Development Cooperation Agency, GIZ, based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. You're also going to stand.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just one little comment, like Anna didn't allow me to make a comment on Sven's presentation, but I wanted to wanted to have one. So I've been working for GIZ, the German Development Agency, before, and actually the project I worked and developed this TAN tool. I just wanted to explain briefly. So it stands for tracking adaptation in NDCs, and all it does is it takes the information from NDCs and puts them in an inventory. So, for example, if a country says it has certain sectors as priorities, then the TAN tool would tell you that this country has these priorities. But it doesn't make any interpretation. So, therefore, don't hesitate to use the TAN tool. And you used it, which is good. It's available on our website, adaptationcommunity.net. Thank you. Okay. I'm basically following up from what Megan has been doing with the OECD database. I've done the same for the scientific literature and searched for adaptation evaluations in the literature. Oh, this is the final slide. This is not the, I think I have to go. Okay, so this is, I have to go to the very top. Okay. Okay, we restart. And then I just do, oh, here and to the right. Oh, no, to the left. Ah, okay, good, it works. Okay, I think I could be, because we are short on time, I spare you all what you already know. Just pointing out again, we are not on track at all to stay under the 2-degree target. We are heading way beyond. We're currently on a beyond 3 degrees trajectory. And therefore, adaptation, oh gosh, I'm still using the wrong one. Adaptation is key. We have to be looking at adaptation, because if we don't, then we will have lots of what we are not allowed to call loss and damage. Now it works. Okay, so moving straight to the evaluation. Where do we find evaluation in the Paris Agreement? My favorite article is Article 7.9d, which states that countries shall, as appropriate, engage in adaptation planning, which may include monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So there's a shall and may, but in any case, it's important that the Paris Agreement explicitly points to the importance of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. That was a great success to have this explicitly in the agreement. And when it comes to the purposes of adaptation evaluations, it's in efficacy, learning, and accountability have been recognized already 15 years ago by the Adaptation Policy Framework of UNDP and by UNFCCC itself. And 5 years ago, when we had the second conference of this type in DC, and some of us were present, I also presented at the time, and back then we already concluded adaptation was important to be evaluated. Oh gosh. Okay, this is a disaster. Apparently I don't learn, but let's get to this slide now. So if you look at the development of impact evaluations over time, there has been a drastic increase. This is a journal article from last year which looked at the number of impact evaluations in scientific journals. You see a steep increase and a surprising decline, or just short drop, let's say. The question is, since so many impact evaluations have become available, what proportion has there been on adaptation evaluations? I'm not allowed to use this. I just use the mouse only. Yeah, okay. So in 2010, there was a review of climate change evaluations, which concluded that the evidence base on climate change interventions is minimal. In 2014, at the time of the second conference, we also had very, very few. I think there was only one adaptation evaluation being presented. So the question of my research here was, what is the number in 2019? How many impact evaluations on adaptation do we have in the published literature? So I did a systematic review of adaptation evaluations in scientific journals. I focused only on those articles which explicitly said they would be doing adaptation to climate change. Because it is, of course, difficult to say what is adaptation, what is not adaptation. So I chose the easy route to say if they didn't say they would adapt, then they were not included in this particular search. Also, I tried to look at what you might call rigorous impact evaluations. So I tried to exclude those which were just, one consultant flies somewhere or has 2 telephone interviews, which might be valuable, but I wanted more robust results. And actually you might not get those ones published anyway. So they had to go through the peer review process. I excluded the ex-ante evaluations and process and formative evaluations too. There were 3 types of sources which I used. One was the Web of Science database, which is one of the largest databases for scientific articles. Has got 33,000 journals. I also looked at the evaluation database of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluations, 3IE, which has more than 4,600 impact evaluations. And finally, to validate these, I also asked a number of experts, some of them are here in the room, to point me to any published articles which they might know. What were the results? So again here, detail on the search process. In this case, I only searched for title, and any of these three terms had to appear in the title in any order. So that's a limitation. We're coming to this. But this was what the Web of Science, it led to 72 results, but very few of them were actually relevant. So of the 71 unique hits, 1/3 were approximately ex-ante evaluations. 10 of them were just looking at climate assessments, climate impact assessments and not actual evaluations. Others looked at evaluating the planning process. So there were actually 0 adaptation evaluations that I could find with these keywords in the entire Web of Science. And that was a very surprising finding to me. The 3IE database had 1 relevant evaluation, and the 10 experts led me to another 3. So these are the published adaptation impact evaluations which I found on adaptation in Ethiopia and social protection mechanisms, cash transfer programs in Zambia, climate smart farming in Tanzania, and a brand new one in the journal Nature Climate Change. 2 of them used propensity score matching and 2 used RCTs. So that's all that was apparently there. And it caused a particular problem for me because I was doing this as part of my PhD, and the assignment had the requirement to have 5 impact evaluations in your area of focus. And my professor wouldn't believe that there aren't 5. So this was a bit difficult. So we need more evaluations. So one way to convince him was I found a couple of reviews that looked at evaluations. You can't call them meta-evaluations because they didn't look into the findings. But for example, the first one looked at climate services evaluations, and again it found most of them were only ex-ante evaluations or process or formative evaluations, and hardly any ex-post evaluations at all. So I could validate the findings this way. What are some possible explanations? We've already heard from Megan that evaluating adaptation is quite challenging, and there was this nice publication which Dennis Burrs, who is here with us in the audience, has published 2014 explaining the challenges of evaluating adaptation. So in one of the reviews they concluded that this would lead to tempting commissioners to defer evaluation or rely on more easily tracked metrics. A second explanation is that adaptation, whilst it's not new, very few projects have been finally completed. They are only just, the number of projects which are being completed are increasing they're starting now to increase, but the first generation is only just getting finished. And finally, this headline should of course not be identical, but there are few incentives for institutions like the JEF to publish their findings in scientific journals. Of course, then therefore you wouldn't find them. 2 more slides. This is another one. So this illustrates the difficulty of finding those evaluations. So this is an evaluation which from the title, abstract and content could very much qualify as adaptation evaluation, but it just doesn't use the term adaptation. So it does risk insurance help to recover from disaster. It could very much be an adaptation strategy or option, but it doesn't mention the term adaptation. It mentions climate change only once. And my guess is that it's because the American Journal for Agricultural Economics is quite conservative. Maybe they didn't want to go into this debate, but so the question for me in improving my search further is how I can get those articles, even if they don't necessarily mention adaptation. If they mention neither adaptation nor climate change, then it's of course very difficult to find the term. If you do such a systematic review, you will also see the term adaptation is being used in all types of different fields, from child psychology to whatnot, so there are plenty of articles which are not even relevant. Final slide, what does that mean? What's the implication? First implication, this is from Picciotto, who was also the keynote presenter at the last adaptation, the second International Conference on Evaluation and Development, is that evaluators need to focus more on uncertainty and complexity when they want to evaluate adaptation, and that we need to completely reinvent the project evaluation kind of cycle. And this is also what the keynote speaker this year on Friday will be focusing on. Michael Patton. The implication for adaptation is that the traditional planning, implementation, review cycle takes far too long in order to wait for it to, to be fully run and then inform again 10 years later the adaptation projects, because by then climate change will have drastically increased. Also, we do need, because of that, we need to find more creative ways to inform adaptation planning with the best available evidence, but we can't necessarily wait for all these RCTs to be done. And finally, donors need to pay more attention to utility-focused evaluation and learning. That is the conclusion, but we have got one more advertisement for you. Last week at the UN Summit, coinciding with the UN Summit, we published this background paper for the Global Commission on adaptation metrics. So if you're interested in this, it's a great way to get into the topic as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timo, for your very comprehensive presentation on your systemic review. I'm wondering if there are, I see one question.
Very interesting. I had two questions. One is, have you looked at the disaster risk management facilities? Because sometimes they do evaluations basically on adaptation, but it's just a different terminology. Maybe that would help spread your net a little more. The second is, Megan had mentioned some shortcomings or limitations of trying to do evaluation work. And I'm just wondering, to what extent did some of the 4 or the 5 you managed to find actually overcome some of the obstacles in terms of generating a counterfactual, because these are impact evaluations, which I understand are hard in adaptation. So to what extent were they able to address some of these?
On the first question, no, I didn't look into the disaster on any other databases, but thank you very much for the comment, because I'm trying to improve the search function, so this is a very good point to take into account. On the second point, so one of these 4 articles which did a propensity score matching, they later on published another article with a qualitative analysis to explain the causal, factors that could lead to adaptation. So that was a very interesting finding, that even if the impact evaluation itself was a robust one, using a robust technique, they could only really explain the adaptation mechanism through an additional qualitative inquiry. So this is how one of the articles did it. Another one of the 4 used an RCT, but was very weak on explaining the actual mechanisms that led to adaptation. So the conclusion, one of the conclusions which I had in my paper at university was, even if you use a rigorous impact evaluation technique, it doesn't guarantee that your findings are rigorous, certainly not in regard to adaptation.
Thank you. I think we are going to move on for the last presentation, and then we'll have some time for more discussion on all the presentations at once. So the final presentation of this session is on transformative change for rural environmental sustainability in India, a case study of leveraging gender equality and women's empowerment for evaluating climate change adaptation, by Yogesh Jadhav. I'm going to, so you're already there. you have a presentation and also a short video. Yogesh is an environmental practitioner with 20 years of experience in pioneering developmental projects and delivering evidence-driven impacts in social and environmental programs. He leads the operations of the Indian NGO Barli Development Institute for Rural Women. Earlier, he worked on forest sustainability and climate change adaptation programs and delivered outputs of multi-million-dollar national-level policy impacting projects. Yogesh? Are you okay there?
Thank you, Anna, for that, so flattering introduction. But I meant that for that, the souvenir, but not for this. It's very long, but thank you so much. And I request the volunteers to close the doors, please. I mean, it's getting time for the mayor's office bus, and don't please move. I'm just joking. I chose this topic for this August conference because in the first conference which I attended in 2008, I was really thrilled about the topic, which I never knew it was. I mean, evaluation and gender, because with due respect to the schedule, many times gender is the last agenda, like this is my last presentation, but I will not risk taking the honor of having the last word. I'll leave it to Anna. So it was a little bit a long presentation. I tried to skip it and shrink it. I would like to start with this ancient Indian hymn from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Asatoma sadgamaya tamsoma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritam gamaya om shanti shanti shanti. The meaning of this embodies the spirit of transformative change. That is, it's an ode to the Creator. Transform our lives from falsehood towards truth. Accompany us from darkness towards light. Lead us from death towards immortality. Let there be peace, physical, mental, spiritual. And when I was preparing the presentation, I was just thinking that climate change is not something to look from a NASA satellite and look the Earth to be green, blue. It has to be on the ground because we are living on the ground, flying sometimes and spending some carbon credits or gaining or losing them. But still we have to live on the ground. So on the ground strategies for mitigating or adapting wherever possible is the need of the hour. It's not just greatest job to really awaken us, but we as evaluators have our ethical responsibility for really looking into all the dimensions of climate change, including the gender. Gender is such a dimension which we take it for granted. Since the morning and since 2 days, I have been trying to grasp where is it reflected. It's reflected everywhere. People respect the gender dimension, equality, blah, blah. But then when we try to think, not from the feminist point of view, but from a human resource point of view, more than 50% of around 50% of the population is not at all mainstreamed or asked, or let us say, involved, engaged into this dialogue, discourse of global climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and really curbing that 3 degrees. It's a revelation for me. 3 degrees. And the recent events in India, they show that the rainfalls have really drastically increased nearly in all the states, 200%. Now we cannot say it's just coincidence. Of course, we all know it, the reasons. And the heat waves, they are killing off the livelihood systems, the safety nets of the rural and tribal people, and mostly the most vulnerable persons, the populations are the tribal women who are being impacted by this. In this slide, I tried to gel down that communities are also impacting climate change, rural environmental sustainability. First is natural resources depletion, overharvesting, unsustainable practices, and although many GIS pictures, they show that India's cover, I mean, I'm talking about Indian perspective because my case study and my study has been, I have tried to draw lessons from my own institution, Barli Development Institute for Rural Women, and it's based in central India. So it is showing increase in forest cover, but it's mostly in the peri-urban places, not in the tribal areas. Forest degradation, traditional land rights, and when we try to position women's empowerment and gender equality in climate change discourse, we need to take care of these aspects. The rights of tribal women, they are not recognized by even their own families, leave alone the communities or leave alone the government who is managing them. The traditional patriarchal family structures are to blame a little bit, but moreover, it is the illiteracy of the rural tribal women which hampers their progress. And then there is this issue of gender ratio at childbirth, all leading to the rural poverty and mismanagement of the rural resources. So there is a definite need for training rural and tribal women in evaluating climate change adaptation. Now, when we think about climate change adaptation, there are so many studies, funds spent on evaluations, adaptation projects, and then they keep on going. But I have not seen or I have not heard one single incidence that evaluations are pulled back into the policies, or policies are really reflecting evaluation. If at all, please correct me. Since past 3 days, I have been attending several workshops and presentations. Maybe tomorrow I am hopeful for that, but really it's a bleak possibility. Now, we spend in our institution just $1 per day per girl, per woman, for the training and development, including climate change adaptation training, including livelihoods, including rural resource development, including health, that's needed. But we have to be involved on the ground. Why? The reason being that the tribal women are the real custodians and users of the forest, what they come from. They are the direct users of the indigenous knowledge systems, and they are major contributors to sustaining their rural livelihoods. Now, as a result, the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation are first sensed by the rural and tribal women. In order to build sustained resilience, there is a need to empower and train them. And at Barli Development Institute, we believe that women are the drivers of climate change adaptation. The mission, we can read it here. The gist of it is to really train these rural women as social change agents, physical, mental, socio-cultural, spiritual resources of their area where they come from. The institute was established in 1985. It conducts 3 months free residential training programs. Each batch size is of 260 girls who are adolescents to young women, age 15-25. And till date, we have trained around 116 batches have really passed, and 8,800 women have been trained here. And the training is very intensive and immersive, which is evidence-driven, and which engages in experiential learning and uses continuous interactive evaluation methods. This is a small picture of the girls standing in the field. This is our organic farm, and we have trained more than 8,800 women, and it provides an really enabling atmosphere and environment for hands-on training. I just like to bullet, those training program, the modules which we have here, which contribute towards adaptation, training, and resilience building practices, and when they go back home. First is composting, which really reduces the inorganic urea taking. Then biological control of weeds instead of roundups. Then biodynamic control of insects. Managing soil fertility, shelter belts, windbreaks, use of selective agriculture, agro-horticultural practices, medicinal plants for safety nets, and then climate-smart agriculture for like drip irrigation, etc. The pedagogy is very down toward grassroots. I mean, it draws on peer tutoring, interactive debating, presentations, group learning, all in all contributing to rapid learning and enhancement of overall personality. The 6 months training includes mapping the felt climate changes using indigenous methods and local people's indicators. All throughout this presentation, I have heard about big figures, data, crunching, and AI now it is in the forefront for managing climate and adaptation, etc. But when we go to the ground, the people's indicators are the ones which we are really experiencing. So that we try to map and train them in. And after the training, 100% become literate, interpersonal skills are boosted, health curriculum trains them in taking care of their own health and their families, and the hands-on sustainability practices, they use it in their homes and villages, making them more resilient. We also have the solar food processing, which trains them into using alternate energy resources, and vocational training, which makes them more self-reliant. And they also take up studies when they go back home. We also got this UNEP's award, Global 500 Rule of Honor Award for our practices, and some more awards. You can see on the website also. All in all, I just try to skip it. We contribute to more than 9 SDGs. And since I have 1 minute left, I'm just skipping them. I understand. Okay. I like to share this video of a girl named Kali who completed training 10 years ago. All these women have been trained at Barli. So this is a request for everyone, educate another Kali and be part of the change. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Dorothy Lux from Eval SDGs. It was really a question with regard to the types of evaluations, that most of what you've been talking about is more terminal evaluations of programs and projects, whereas for those of us who are involved in a lot of adaptation exercises, we're turning much more towards process evaluations and adaptive ways of using evaluative evidence for looking at both environmental and program changes. So moving away from project cycles more into embedded organic change in institutions. Has there been any consideration by any of the panel in looking at new approaches to evaluations rather than living in a previous paradigm?
I'm Pei Xuan. I'm with the Independent Evaluation Office at the GEF. I have 2 questions, one for Megan and one for Swan. Megan, you mentioned based on your findings, the adaptation projects perform better than the mitigation ones. I was wondering, have you communicated these findings to the countries or to the decision makers, or have they taken any actions based on their findings? Would that affect the future project design or anything? And for Swan, I was struck by the map you show, like the unequally distributed the funding. Has your analysis found any factors contribute to that? Is that because the institutional capacity at the country level, or because the agencies are more familiar with the process of conducting projects? I was wondering, have you found any factors contribute to that? Thank you.
This one is for Timo.
Your name?
Dennis Boers, still. Sustainability-focused ex-post evaluations are often not RCTs or use PSM. So publication and peer-reviewed journals can be hard for such type of work. Equally, evaluators often focus on utilization of findings, and the process of publishing in peer-reviewed journals can be long and tedious, and does not necessarily feed into on-the-ground utilization of findings. Have you considered going for evaluations that have not been published, but have some kind of a quality assessment?
Thanks. My name's Catherine Shea from the World Resources Institute. And Megan, I think it was you who first brought up the lack of baseline data, especially on adaptation. And I wondered if you had seen, or if any of you could actually comment on not just lack of baseline data, but changing metrics, because these sort of biophysical data and our ability to gather it, given technology changes, is changing so rapidly. It seems that the metrics that people are looking to evaluate according to are changing along with that technology. And I wondered if any of you had comments on that.
Thank you. I think we'll start with Megan, and then maybe Timo.
Okay, so on this question about have I communicated, you are the first people I've ever communicated any of this thinking to, so if you think that would be interesting to somebody, please tell me who, and I would be happy to communicate with them some of those findings. I would be curious if that is something that others have seen in their work, that adaptation is scoring better on project completion reports, or coming up better in evaluation findings, or is that just an anomaly of the work that we happen to have in our database? In terms of the lack of baseline data, I'm not sure that I have anything to add to your question, but I think that is very true, and I think the other aspect is that the objectives themselves are often ill-defined, and so it's very hard to, what is the baseline that you are supposed to be gathering at the baseline level? For example, the objective of the program is defined as improving capacities, but specifically what capacities, what is the, are you trying to go from level 3 to level 5, and what is the distinction between those levels in institutional capacities or family capacities, village capacities? So often there's a lack of the specificity about the objective that then means that even the measures, it's unclear what it is that you're trying to measure, even if you could. And I agree, there's a lot of interesting developments in terms of the technological advances that are coming very quickly now, but we're probably not utilizing those in evaluation the way we could. In terms of the old paradigm, yes. From the side of the OECD DAC, we have very recently approved a set of principles for results-based management for sustainable development. And the big emphasis of those principles is on adaptive approaches and learning-focused approaches to results, trying to course correct on some of the very sort of rigid accountability-focused results approaches that have been in practice over many years. I think in terms of our members and their approaches to evaluation, I have not heard of any particularly related to climate adaptation that are trying more iterative or adaptive approaches to program design, monitoring, and evaluation. I think most of the good examples we've seen have been coming out of peace building and also governance evaluations and in those sectors. I'm sure there are adaptation and climate-related examples, but two of the members that I would flag in particular would be NORAD, the Norwegian Evaluation Agency. They've also done quite a bit of interesting evaluation work around learning and what do we actually mean by a learning culture that is able to adapt to changing circumstances, changing assumptions, or those type of issues. And also DFID, I think, has actually done quite a bit of interesting work on adaptive approaches.
Thank you. On the question on the old paradigms, I likewise fully agree with that. In fact, the last bullet point on my slide was because we can't wait for the cycle to repeat. We need to find creative, solutions, and you were outlining exactly those solutions. So I'm very keen to learn more from you afterwards on some of these examples. On Dennis' question, yes, of course. So again, this systematic review was inspired by my PhD work. So my supervisor said, oh, not my supervisor, the course teacher was saying only peer-reviewed published articles count. And that's why I had, this restriction. It was nevertheless interesting to find that there are very few in the published literature. But if we wanted to map the actual evidence base, of course, we would need to consider all those which the Jeff and all these other organizations are doing. One more interesting implication is that the IPCC 6 assessment report, usually the IPCC is meant to include only peer-reviewed academic journal articles. So they would find very little evidence on like rigorous but the key point, again, is for adaptation to explain in how far the intervention actually led to adaptation, and adaptation to what and for whom. And in these articles which I found, the articles weren't necessarily good in explaining this. So this one article needed another article to explain the finding from its own scoring. So the key for adaptation is explaining why was it adaptation and for whom.
Perhaps just an idea. I mean, you could talk to your professor and point him to Howard White and Campbell and indicate that even Campbell is moving away from only published articles for systematic reviews. I mean, Cochrane a bit less, but Campbell, yes they are. So we did some work on that, and including not published. So on uneven allocation, yes. Well, actually, that's a call for all of you, right? To look at and perhaps replicate sort of our study to understand where allocation of fund goes. For Germany, well, a couple of reasons. I mean, one of perhaps the most central reasons is that climate proofing and vulnerability assessment is not sort of consistently mainstreamed in the decision, right? So no wonder. And there are, of course, and it makes also a lot of sense for development cooperation. There are other strategic priorities that come into play. So it's not all. But yeah, it would be interesting to learn from other organizations, other donors. What kind of patterns do you see? Because then we have a much stronger case than just one bilateral donor. Oh, and perhaps just as a side note, seeing a room full of experts here. So if anyone of you is also working on the issue that I raised on limits to adaptation, loss and damage, it would be great to have a conversation, because we're really looking for friends, peers, others who are interested to work in that space, precisely because of the issues I highlighted in my presentation. So really interested to talk to you afterwards.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to wrap up the session because we have run out of time. My timekeeper keeps telling me. Overall, I would say one thing we can draw from this session is that climate change adaptation is under evaluated, especially in comparison to climate change mitigation and some other environmental areas. But there are more and more evaluations. There are more and more activities and projects that have been testing different types of new technologies and new ways of all different types of adaptation measures, and they are being evaluated despite the challenges of evaluating adaptation. And, not all of them make it into science, journals and things like that, but there are more and more evaluations. I could say just from the adaptation work that the Jeff administers, and our evaluation office also evaluates the Least Developed Countries Funds and the Special Climate Change Fund. For LDCF, 4 years ago we did an evaluation and there were only 11 completed projects. And now we're going to look at the fund again, and there's over 30 completed projects. So there's more and more for us to work with. And then I also wanted to say something about Yogesh's presentation, that we should not lose sight of what's happening on the ground, and we can actually see people who are in their daily lives, in their realities, living and adapting to climate change. So thank you very much, and I hope you all go to the reception and enjoy the award ceremony.